incubated phase and to see where he continues his intellectual endeavors. So thank you for making the trek transatlantic to present this talk. So Nader, please, the platform is yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Solomon, for having me and allowing me to speak to you all. It's really an honor for me to be able to share this material here with the Berlage, which is a really sort of an institution that we get to, for the most part, only experience at long distance, right, from overseas. It's actually astonishing that for a school as well known as it is, that when you're actually in Rotterdam, hardly anyone can actually tell you where it's located, which is a funny little paradox. Many of you probably saw the Barack Obama speech earlier tonight, and I think that warrants acknowledgement. And like a lot of people, I sort of share some of the optimism that people espouse, surrounding what he brings. But perhaps also, like a lot of you, especially here in Europe, I also feel a certain ambivalence toward the figure. One of the things that he's talked about is his interest in trying to, let's say, modernize the infrastructure. And one question that I ask myself in my current research, and this is one of the things that I'd actually like to think out loud with you about after going through this presentation, is the question, what is infrastructure? I think that there are really some interesting new horizons about infrastructure and infrastructure design on the horizon. And I think that, for me at least, this project that I did on Otto Neurath has helped feed and inform that concern. And maybe at the end of this presentation, I'll talk about why. I'm going to spend most of this talk presenting the material, some of the material from the book. I'm assuming that most of you aren't familiar with it, and that's why I'm going to do so. But at the end, I'll sort of maybe talk a little bit more about what I'm working about now. If you were at the turn of the 20th century, most leftist, particularly far leftist intellectuals, were rather skeptical, or as you say, even especially in the 19th century, late 19th century, rather skeptical about what the modern metropolis could achieve. And when people looked at cities like Manchester, right, the heart of industrialization, particularly leftist intellectuals, they didn't see productivity per se. They didn't necessarily see efficiency. First and foremost, what they saw was depravity, and what they saw was also poverty. Frederick Engels, for instance, writes, "In the industrial epoch alone has it become possible that the worker, scarcely freed from feudal servitude, could be used as mere material, that he must let himself be crowded into a dwelling too bad for every other, which he, for his hard-earned wages, buys the right to let utterly go to ruin." Right? So the modern metropolis, for someone like Friedrich Engels in his book, The Conditions of the Working Class in England, participated in the oppression of the working class. And so this is the kind of image that he imagined, people living in dank and dark circumstances with poor ventilation, overcrowding, surrounded by disease. Now, I think by the early 20th century, people were no longer of this mindset, and there were a lot of very progressive intellectuals, some Marxist intellectuals, that in fact believed that social transformation did not need to be looked at through the lens of class alone, that the city itself could be transformed in socially productive ways. And Otto Neurath, I think, should be seen in that light. as someone who was really trying to understand and inaugurate a model of urbanism and a model of urban planning that promoted civic participation and democratic change, right? So who was this figure, who was this guy Otto Neurath? Well, if you studied philosophy, you probably know of him already. Otto Neurath was one of the founders of a movement or of a group that called itself the Vienna Circle, which was dedicated to promoting what they called the scientific conception of the world. What people don't, however, know about him, and which I really try to highlight in the book and through my own research, was that he was a lot of other things too. He was a museum director. He directed a museum called the Gesellschafts- und Wirtschaftsmuseum, the Museum of Society and Economy, which was located in Vienna between the years 1925 and 1934. He was a housing reformer. He published pamphlets and books like the one you see here. And he was also an elephant. He signed his correspondences with pictures rather than words. And you'll probably be able to piece together why by the end of this talk. Now, what did Neurath have to say about what people like Engels, what did Neurath think about what people like Engels had to say? Well, on the one hand, he thought Engels was right. In the first decade of the 20th century, Neurath studied in Berlin. He basically studied economic history and sociology under a person named Gustav Schmoller, who was actually the most famous economist of his time. And Neurath hated Berlin. He utterly hated the city. He said in his correspondences, "Berlin does not simulate sightseeing very much, wealthy but neither beautiful nor attractive. I miss our Austrian sociability everywhere." He was Austrian. He was from Vienna himself. And he was homesick, basically. And in a sense for him, cities like Berlin, and Berlin was really grew at a staggering pace between 1880 and 1920. It probably more than doubled in population. It really sort of exemplified all the things that he thought was wrong with modernity. And probably the most, let's say, clear exemplification of what was wrong with the modern metropolis was what was termed the Mietskaserne, the rental barrack, right? And the Mietskaserne were basically, they were rental barracks, homes for the working class. They were poorly lit, they were poorly lit and poorly ventilated. They had very tiny light shafts, so people didn't have access to Licht, Luft und Sonne, right? Air, light, and sun, which became the mantra of CM 20-odd years later. At the same time, though, Neurath disagreed with Engels in one, I think, important respect. And ironically enough, Neurath saw promise in war and in the state of war. And this is actually something kind of interesting to come back to, because if you read, certainly in the US presses nowadays, most even leftist economists will tell you that what really got the US economy out of the Great Depression was not the New Deal, at least Paul Krugman says this, but actually World War II. So we might actually read Neurath into the history of the military-industrial complex as well. That aside, however, Neurath saw promise in war, and in war economies in particular. Why is that? Now war caused suffering, and Austro-Hungary sustained greater losses than probably any country in the entire world during World War I, the period between 1914 and 1918. As many as 2 million deaths resulted directly or indirectly from that. And so after the war, you had soldiers, war-wounded soldiers wandering around. Now, what Neurath said was actually positive about the war economy is that it helped revolutionize the peacetime economy. He says, I see for the immediate future the peace economy will be arranged for military purposes more strictly so far, and it seems to me not to the disadvantage of the peacetime economy. And what he recognized was that, ironically enough, the living conditions of the working class actually improved during periods of wartime struggle. Now, how did it improve? Well, one of them is that the war economy utterly transformed. Capitalism and global capitalism as it existed at the time. In Vienna, for instance, starting in during World War I, but actually even intensifying in the immediate after, you saw the emergence of barter markets such as these. Currency was of less value than bread. Supply lines were cut. People needed access to foodstuffs and resources, and so they improvised solutions as a result. And Neurath saw promise in that, in part because it inspired a sense of community, right? Or Gemeinschaft, as Ferdinand Tönnies might say. It appears in some regions at times one can buy 1 kilogram of salt for 1 kilogram of meat, 1 kilogram of sugar for 1 kilogram of butter. This experience should move us all to organize barter exchanges and make them available to all. Right? There's nothing like a crisis to bring people together. Right? I've always found that in my family, certainly, that's the case. We bicker and bicker and bicker until someone gets sick. And then everything is great. Right? And Nader was sort of thinking along the same lines. And in Vienna, I think it was images like these that he drew inspiration from. To the left is a factory. To the right is an allotment garden, a Kleingarten. Have you guys seen them around here in the Dutch countryside or elsewhere? Are you familiar with them at all? Right? It's a place of. Are you familiar with them? They still exist. In fact, they've become very fashionable in Berlin. No longer just a working class pastime. It's basically a garden you retreat to on the edge of a city where you can cultivate foodstuffs and sort of have a brief respite, like a mini daily vacation. You don't necessarily have a place to sleep there. But during the World War I, people actually lived in them. And what Neurath liked about these things was that, what he liked about this image in particular was that for him the ideal of, let's say, a modernity was to, in a sense, plan a world in which you could mix industrialization with what he later termed agricultural self-help, providing for your own food, building your own home, and so forth, right? And interestingly, it was citizen planners, such as the ones you see here, that he idealized and romanticized the most, right? You know, you're probably familiar from your theory or history courses with the image of Le Corbusier, right, with his hand over his Ville Radieuse, or I'm not sure which project it was, or the Contemporary City for 3 million, one of them, right? I am the master planner. Now, this model of urbanism was anathema to Neurath. And what he was instead interested in were these spontaneous and improvised attempts to reappropriate the urban landscape. So in the caption to this image, the National Geographic journalist who took this photograph writes, "The baby's father is a carpenter and built the wagon in the picture from an old packing case and painted it bright blue." Right? So this cradle was made from a simple packing case. And in a sense, this became a model of urbanism and productive urbanism for Neurath. There was one problem, however, with this phenomenon. In Vienna during World War I and immediately afterwards, there were people literally squatting en masse on the periphery of the city, building their own homes, cultivating their own gardens, taking trash out of the trash cans and making productive use of it. The problem, however, was that that it caused a kind of anarchy, right? So the coal shortage in Vienna caused the denuding of this forest, right? And what Neurath believed was that in order to really plan the city productively, there had to be a way in which there was coordinating planning from above, but at the same time spontaneous expressions of self-organization from below. And he created an organization under the auspices of the Social Democratic government in Vienna in 1923, known as the Settlement for Allotment, the Settlement and Allotment Garden Association. Right? Now, he created this, very elaborate tree diagram, right, in keeping with the times and the enthusiasm for social engineering and management theory from the U.S. And this is what this movement was about. He said, the Settlement and Allotment Garden Association is helping to gradually undo the modern metropolis by leaving apartment construction administration to cooperatives, housing groups, and related organizations, and by consolidating all matters relating to housing construction from the production of raw materials to the construction of homes. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, basically, this is the kind of housing that got built in Vienna during World War I. This is what he wanted to promote. He wanted to take the innovations of people like Henry Ford, right? Someone who inaugurated the assembly line, and apply it to self-help based planning and design, right? So he wanted to go from this to this, right? Which he felt would be more efficient, ultimately more productive. And part of the organization's job was to help facilitate that. So what tools did he have at his disposal in this endeavor? They had a publication known as Der Siedler. Communication was always vital from the outset. The Der Siedler means the settler. They staged protests. Public protests, these sort of self-help settlers, and there were many of them, probably approximately 10% of the entire population of Vienna could have been classified as such during this period. There were many hundreds of thousands of squatters, educated squatters, as well as non-educated or not so educated squatters alike. But what they wanted to show was that they were disciplined, and that's where these protests came in handy. The gentleman standing here was the then mayor. He was courting voters. His name was Jakob Reumann. And this guy here is Neurath. Big, burly guy, kind of as big as an elephant. This is one reason why he signed his name with pictures. And then the crowd. And this was their symbol, right? The triangle and the shovel, right? Work and intellect. And it was designed by Adolf Loos. Right? And Loos was very involved in this whole undertaking as well. With wagons, automobiles, and music, the settlers and allotment gardeners marched along carrying their characteristic poster boards, "Give us land, wood, and stone, and we'll make bread out of it." Right? They also finally held exhibitions. And these exhibitions were often held in front of the Gemeinde Wien, right? The municipal city hall of the city. And in front, they held exhibitions. They staged exhibitions. And this was the allotment garden settlement and living exhibition of 1923. Here's a plan of the event. They had model homes here, model settlement homes here that you could build on a self-help basis. Ordinary people could build them. And then they had various exhibits throughout the courtyards and inside the Volkshalle, the People's Hall. In the vestibule to the ballroom, there's a fur and fur usage exhibit. It is illustrated here what one can make out of rabbit fur. It is probable that the rabbits of allotment gardeners and small animal farmers will be used less for their meat than for their fur, because the uses of fur yields more things. Right? They would make, shoes out of wood because they had no leather, right? And it also, in a sense, made them self-sufficient. This was an exhibit in one of the courtyards showing all of the wonderful fruits and vegetation that resulted from the studious efforts of these gardeners and these citizen designers, right? This is an example of housing design they produced for this event as well, that you could just build on a self-help basis. Now, who was the designer? The designer was an architect by the name of Greta Schulte-Lohotzky. Have any of you guys heard of, do you guys know Greta Schulte-Lohotzky? She was, for those of you who don't, she's most famous for producing the first fully prefabricated kitchen, the Frankfurt kitchen, which was installed in thousands of homes during the mid-1920s in Frankfurt and in many of its chief settlements. And it was an ergonomically designed kitchen as well. She used very extensive and drew on very extensive time motion studies in order to figure out the, let's say, most time-efficient way of preparing, processing, and serving food. Before she did that, however, and that's probably what made her most famous, she also worked in Neurath's office, and she produced Type 7 houses, these sort of houses, what were called core houses that people could build on a self-help basis. And the most important thing about these things is that you could build them in phases. You needed emergency shelter. You would build a single room. Your wife had another child, you would build another room. Eventually you could build into 2 stories. And it was conceived as actually originally a freestanding home. But eventually, as you can see in this diagram, once you built additions, there were enough space to turn it into a row housing typology, right? So it plays between these 2 different housing typologies. So it represented a model of emergency housing, and I think she's one of the central figures in the history, in the unwritten history of emergency housing, but also a model of emergency housing that could be eventually adapted to permanent use. And if you ask me, this actually is an enduring problem that one confronts when you're dealing with emergency design situations in the contemporary global landscape, right? You have people living in camps, let's say in the Chad region, for very extended periods of time, but being housed in tents that were designed to last at most, for maybe 3 years, and yet they've been there longer. And of course, there are other refugee camps, such as we find in Palestine, that have been around for over almost half a century. So there are a lot of emergency housing solutions that are hampered by the fact that, or even, of course, around Katrina, people living in mobile homes for countless numbers of years. Emergency housing designs that don't actually make provisions for what you do in the event that the place you're living in actually needs to become permanent. And I think Schulte-Lohotzky was important in terms of understanding and grasping that dynamic and how to address it. The core house makes it possible for anyone who's able to get together the amount to move into a cheery 3-bedroom dwelling within 5 to 10 weeks that can offer shelter for a couple of years until he or she secures the means to expand. Right? So emergency housing that can then be adapted to permanent housing. That was the ideal. That you could build on your own, right? Using your own sweat labor, sweat equity, as you might call it in the contemporary jargon. This is a view of one of the of a sort of a sketch of an interior that Schulte-Lohotzky envisioned. You can already appreciate her her grasp of the importance of economy in terms of programmatic economy, in terms of the arrangement of the various spaces internal to these dwellings. This is an image of one core house, not core house type 7, but core house type 4. Right. This is one version of the house that could stand, and this is actually another version. Right. A few expanded houses that one can call core houses. First stage on the right, second stage on the left. Right? So it's phased housing, phased model of housing. That, of course, would be built by the people who lived in the homes themselves, with the oversight of professionalized architects. And so those included people like Schüttelhotzky, Adolf Loos was somewhat involved. Joseph Frank was very much involved, as well as a number of other important architects of the period from both Austria and Germany. Now, what happened, however, was that this movement, which started around in an organized way, this order-disorder, right? Experiment, order, disorder, started around 1919 in Vienna and then ended around 1923. Why did it end? Well, in part it ended because the economy stabilized, the crown stabilized, which drew people away from these self-help experiments and back into the workplace. They also, however, found that many of these self-help builders were far less efficient in terms of time, how quickly they would put these houses up, than they originally anticipated. The housing settlement will always remain a more evolved type of dwelling, Neurath writes. However, we recognize that the high-rise apartment has time on its side due to the present economic circumstances. Now, back then there was this big debate between the people who advocated for high-rise living and the ones that advocated for, let's say, row house living. And Neurath was actually for these sort of self-help-based row houses, like a lot of other people, and there were others that weren't. And ultimately, the ones that were for high-rise, what they called Gemeindebauten, which were 5- and 6-story walk-up apartments, places like the Karl-Marx-Hof, won out, at least in the context of this debate in the 20s. Now, Neurath did not give up, though, in terms of wanting to promote participatory and interactive and citizen-based models of urbanism and design. And with that spirit in mind, he helped establish what was known as the Museum of Society and Economy, which I think represented not just a way of revolutionizing the modern museum, but revolutionizing the way in which we think about cities in relationship to communication and information. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that back then, right, or even a couple years later, if you asked a good Orthodox modernist, what does every city need, and what is every city at its essence? They would say it's 4 functions. That was Le Corbusier's response, right? Work, transport, living, and leisure, right? There's no mention of information or communication there. And which I think actually makes Neurath's interest in the modern museum and how it relates to the city especially forward-thinking. That I think he really grasped the power of the importance of communication and its dissemination in the city a long time before many others did. Now, this it was housed in the Gemeinde Wien, in the city hall. Right? So it wasn't just a cultural institution, it was also, of course, social and political. The city hall was in the center of the city, right? So everyone could have access. Free, tours, films. He was a big proponent of media, and I'll talk about that. When was it open? Sundays, Tuesdays, and Fridays. Sundays 9 to 1, Tuesdays 5 to 7, Fridays 5 to 7. The reason? Any takers? Why?
Because that's when the working class.
Exactly. The worker only has time to visit the museum at night. Right? That was the intention. So he wanted to democratize the modern museum in many respects so that it became more accessible to the working class. The goal was to educate the working class about production, immigration, mortality, interior furnishing, unemployment, and the fight against tuberculosis and alcoholism. The city is not just a form. The city is not just a thing. The city is really a constellation of socio-economic and a product of social, economic, health-related forces, as well as physical matter. And he wanted to really instill that understanding in the public, right? I think even today it's really difficult for non-specialists to grasp like what a program is and why it would be relevant, right? Or to think about the relationship between how we use things, how things are used versus, the forms that surround them. And part of his effort was to really promote this kind of understanding, which of course I think has its own set of limitations that we could talk about, but that has its own, should be a separate discussion. This is the interior space. It was in the Volkshalle, the People's Hall in the Municipal Town Hall. It was one of the first artificially illuminated indoor museums, which I think is itself significant for how it attempted again to democratize the modern museum and make it accessible at night. It was actually also fashioned in the image of a shop window. Neurath wanted to pull the street into the modern museum in a sense, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. And these are some of the things that you found in there. In fact, by 1928, which is around when this image was taken, there was nothing actually original inside of this museum. There were actually only reproductions, and we'll talk about why in a little bit. Another reason why they installed lights was to make sure that people focused on the diagrams and weren't distracted by the sort of neo-Gothic vaulting overhead. Right? He wanted to concentrate the spectator's attention because ultimately he grasped, like Walter Benjamin grasped after him, that the working class public was ultimately a distracted, or the public at large was ultimately a distracted public. There were lots of demands placed on their attention span. Right? We are exposed to more information today in the span of a few months than most people ever have historically been in their entire lives. And this was, of course, also already the case in metropolitan centers like Vienna in the 1920s. We have reached a point where in the great metropolis, the decentralization of the museum is afoot. These museums should not be treated as central monumental locations, but as moving structures that can transform depending on the purpose of the exhibition. What that means is that the museum should not just be a shop window, right? It also means that the museum should be nomadic in character. They shouldn't just be in cultural districts, right? If any of you visited Vienna, you know that it's a radial city, in a sense. I mean, it has rings around it, right? It has the famous ring around it. And anchoring that city is were the various palaces that were built there over the course of its history. In the 19th century, the liberal government built universities, right? It built a theater, it built a parliament building, but those still stood along what became the ring and still reinforced the idea that the city had a center. Now, Neurath was against that notion that cities should have centers. So he built museums in Gemeindebauten, right? These collectivized walk-up apartment complexes such as these, this one that you see in this image. He installed traveling exhibits, right, so that the museum literally came to people, right, in order to foster this civic dialogue. One could argue whether it was a dialogue, but this idea about civic understanding as being part of one's role living in a city or in a city-state. And Vienna, I think for all intents and purposes, was a city-state and did operate as a kind of city-state during this period. He also staged exhibits in storefronts. Right? This is the insurance agency, I believe. And this was actually a photograph taken from an opposite building, and I found this in a Neurath archive in England, and I find it fascinating. Neurath was excited, right, beside himself with excitement when he attracted crowds. He was not designing information for sovereign, solitary individuals. He was designing information and designing knowledge for the mass consumption. So the crowd was ultimately his audience. This exhibit was seen by 2,000 people every day, some sort of using it as a sort of waiting room and others going there for some minutes every day for knowledge and amusement. Right? So his ideal was that you could, in a sense, be walking to the subway one day and waiting for a train, and then in the course of your time waiting, you could actually absorb knowledge and information. Right? So it was about trying to almost democratize the entire Enlightenment project, right? Which almost seems like a contradiction in terms, but was nonetheless the ideal that he aspired to. This is a view from inside the exhibit. People were interacting with this material. Finally, Neurath developed a whole language for communicating this information. And the language eventually became known as isotype, the International System of Typographic Picture Education. Before that, though, it was known as the Vienna method. And I'll, rather than sort of going through what this is all about, the one thing I want to highlight is that in the early history, the important thing that Neurath wanted to do was to design a visual language of communication that anyone could learn. Right? So that people in the end could participate in the construction and in the communication of scientific knowledge and information through pictorial means in particular. His methods were taught to children, right? In part because he thought that the way to transform the modern metropolis was not to transform it physically, per se, but in a sense to transform it both by transforming the social life of the city as well as the physical life of the city, that the two went hand in hand, right? That transforming the social life of the city could ultimately also transform its physical life, right? There were lots of people living in quote-unquote modernist homes of the period, but living perfectly petty bourgeois lives, right? And anyone living in a Miesian house, certainly the family in the Tugendhat house, bears that example out, right? That what he wanted was not just a modernism that was about form, but also a modernism that was rooted in transforming everyday life. The Lebensgestaltung, the shaping of human life. Some of the earliest diagrams he designed, this was before he designed a full-fledged method, produced diagrams like these. Police arrest in Wien in February 1925. From the effects of alcohol without the effects of alcohol. Right? He was visually trying to put a mirror up to the masses. And here you see the masses, right? Physically, quite literally. And he wanted to do so using a language that people could get, right? That was ultimately accessible. Modern man is very spoiled by cinema and illustrations. He received his education in the most comfortable of means, partly during periods of rest through optical impressions. If one seeks to disseminate socio-scientific education generally, one must use similar means of representation. The modern advertisement will show us the way. Right? You want to learn how to do good design and good communication and foster civic participation? You study modern advertising. This was totally different. If you were most Austro-Marxists during this period, when they wanted to promote enlightenment among the working class, they said, what do you do? Well, they basically had the old Humboldtian approach, right? Read Goethe, read Schiller, read the classics, read Plato, right? Neurath said, look, they love soccer, the masses love cinema, let's use that language. And because that language, in fact, paradoxically enough, can actually also further the Enlightenment project. Now, eventually, Neurath formalized this method of visual communication, and it became known, as I said before, as isotype. Now, one of the pioneers who really designed this language, and again, Neurath was a social scientist, so he wasn't especially graphically inclined, but he was brilliant at putting together collaborations, right, with Schüttel-Hotzky. Another collaborator was Gerrit Arnst, right, who was a German designer who probably became most famous here in the Netherlands. Probably one of the 2 or 3 most prominent Dutch designers and influential Dutch designers of the entire post-war period. And what Arnst did is he created a kind of lexicon of pictorial signs and symbols that they could circulate in a variety of media. This shows, for instance, information about the world's motor car industry in 1929, North and South America and Europe. The point here was to present information simply and effectively. If it took you more than 2 or 3, at most 3 glances to glean information, to take information from this material, then it was probably a bad design. Right? He was really interested in that, in those first impressions, because he believed and he recognized that that's how spectatorship worked in the 20th century. Eventually, this also became a sort of sovereign language, and one of the things Arndts did was he insisted that rather than cutting out symbols, that they mechanize their production methods. Right? So he adopted new printing technologies that could increase their output in terms of pamphlets they produced, diagrams they made. And in the late 1920s and early 1930s, there was a huge outpouring of work that the Museum of Society and Economy, Neurath, Arndts, and their collaborators produced. They made posters. They made a publication called Pictorial Statistics. They made pamphlets for insurance agencies. They made children's books, The Colorful World. They also made slideshows to provide people with professional advice. Right? This was about how to be a barber. They also believed that, again, you could internationalize this project of democratization through visual education. That you didn't just have to copy the contents of the museum, you could also copy, in a sense, the museum itself, which is quite radical because we usually think of a museum as some place you go to where that has something you can't find anywhere else. Right? You go to, let's say, you know what I'm talking about. This was just the reverse logic in terms of the thinking and approach. Hence, in a way, it's sort of a Guggenheim before Guggenheim in some ways, right? Neurath established satellite museums around the world, just as he had wanted to break the idea that there was a ring and a center to culture in Vienna. He wanted to do so around the world, so he created a satellite in The Hague, right? He created a satellite in Moscow. He created a satellite traveling exhibit that went to Berlin. He did stuff in America, in the US, in an effort to globalize this project. And I think this diagram, this greeting card, really bears out the intent behind it. And this diagram was made in 1940 after Neurath fled Vienna. He had to flee Vienna in 1934 because he was sort of pushed out by the fascists in power there. And he relocated it in The Hague, where he lived until 1940, before having to flee again to England when the Netherlands was invaded by the National Socialists in Germany. I think this is a very provocative diagram for me because it's one that I think sort of reveals, in part it reveals Neurath's disenchantment with the project of participation-based design and participation-based urbanism, what we might call open source urbanism by the by the late 1930s. Bear in mind, this is on the eve of the Second World War. He'd been pushed out of one country by the Nazis, and I think ultimately probably felt somewhat betrayed by the very working class masses that he sought to advocate for. His friend Joseph Frank commented in the late 1920s that what the working class masses really wanted was not to live in these sort of modernist homes where their lifestyles would be revolutionized. They really wanted to have this very same things that the petty bourgeoisie wanted, right? And the sort of architecture in Vienna of the early 1930s mirrored that. That's what Joseph Frank said. And while Neurath never really gave in to Frank's cynicism, I think he couldn't have been affected by it. So one of the things that I was fascinated by in the book was the increased role that technology played in Neurath's late career, at least in terms of how I frame his career, that as his confidence in the people, declined, his sort of confidence in technology grew, almost as a kind of compensatory measure. And I think this diagram sort of bears that out. Sort of the crowds go in, isotypes come out. This is just an example I'll show in passing of a urban design diagram that he sort of fashioned for an American architectural periodical late in his career. And he had a row, he had a major falling out with some of the organizers from CM who invited him to collaborate with him in the early 1930s, in part because he advocated again for the sort of making knowledge and information more accessible to the public, and which in a sense I think some modernists took objection to, in part because it put into question their very expertise that they brought to bear on the work that they did. So this was Neurath's answer to people like Siegfried Giedion or Le Corbusier, who were ultimately very, very skeptical of the contributions that he could introduce. Now, as Solomon pointed out, I did an exhibition at Stroom Den Haag, and I had a distinct pleasure of doing an exhibition with Stroom and a book with NAI that, in a sense, was trying to be in dialogue, both in form and content, with some of the subject matter talked about in the book. This is the show. It came accompanied with a pamphlet. The main issue that the exhibition designers and I, the exhibition designers being a great office from New York called Projects, that wanted to deal with is, what do we think about Neurath's whole pretense that you could mass produce museums just like one could Ford Model T automobiles? That's what he wanted to do. He wanted to mass produce museums just like we did automobiles. Now, what did we think about that? And we sort of disagreed, and we were rather ambivalent. On the one hand, there were originals in the show, which in a sense was us taking issue with Neurath. It was a kind of critique of Neurath, ironically enough, to show those originals. But we also included posters and reproductions, in part so that the museum, and these were also posters that we wanted to disseminate. They were sort of exhibitions in miniature. So we were sort of on the fence. And we believed, in a sense, that there is sort of a case to be made for an idea about the original. But I think there's also, I think Neurath recognized aptly the critical and crucial role that media could play in a contemporary civil society. These are the posters. One of the anchor pieces in the show was this historical timeline. And it was really exciting for me to be able to show this piece. It was designed by a Swiss architect, CM member, Rudolf Steiger, in collaboration with a very young Bauhaus graduate and an art historian, and Neurath acted as a sort of advisor. This was installed at a 1935 functional city exhibition, which took place in Amsterdam. And it basically showcased materials from the Fourth Congress, the Functional City Congress of the CM. And it was an anchor piece, it was a centerpiece, but it was immediately taken down after one day. The reason being because the Giedion in particular, and JJP Aud and some other folks feared the political repercussions that this piece might bring. It was, an aggressively anti-capitalist piece that insisted on looking at the city not just from the point of view of form, not just from the point of view of the four functions, which is a rather ahistorical model, but from the point of view of class relationships, for instance. And the ways in which finance capitalism in particular participated in oppressing the working class masses in the modern metropolis. And what was great for me that we only learned in installing the piece was that this was actually the first time that it was shown publicly in Holland since then. So since I was really excited by the symbolism, because while the show is in a sense a show that is a kind of tragedy in 3 acts, it ends, I think, on a sort of positive and optimistic note, and I think that this piece bears that out. There were other sort of pieces by members of CIAM, the International Congress of Modern Architecture, who, again, drew on Neurath's methods in order to visualize the modern or the functional city anew. In the show, we also, like Neurath, sought to project the contents of the show onto the street. Right? So, and you can see that so it was, again, programmed as a sort of 24-hour show at Stroom Den Haag, where there's a real attempt at trying to achieve dialogue between originals and reproductions. We also included some films that Neurath made. Neurath made some amazing animation films for the British government during World War II, propaganda films, that again tried to sort of educate Britons about ways in which they could help support the war effort, very small ways. And so I think it was a sort of course, it was educational, but of course it was propagandistic by the same token. And his growing identification with the mass media, I think, particularly late in his life during the 40s and late 30s, I think, again, for me, sort of bespeaks a certain disenchantment he felt vis-a-vis change and participation in civic involvement. We also have these panels from a book called Gesellschaft und Wirtschaft, these panels over here to the left, which were fashioned both as folios that you could read privately, but which you could also put on the wall. So in a sense, it functioned as a kind of traveling museum, right? Then, of course, some pieces by Cor van Esteren. That was a really exciting show for me to do, and a real honor and a delight, and one that I continue to learn a lot about. And I've really been pleased by the support that I've gotten from the people involved, and as well as the reception. And of course, most importantly, the way it's really informed my own thinking. And a show that I'm working on now at the Center for Architecture in New York is called The Global Polis in Crisis, 1929-2009. And it tries to frame some of the issues from the Stroom incarnation of this material in a more contemporary light, and around this issue of crisis. And it's actually particularly challenging because the crisis is both conceptual and real. Every day it seems like the show is like threatened to be canceled. And that's in part because the Center for Architecture, which relies almost exclusively on membership from practicing architects for its budget, is itself threatened with extinction because of the whole collapse of the building industry in and around particularly the New York region. So it's both a sort of a conceptual challenge, but also a literal challenge, which sort of has created all kinds of interesting and generated lots of interesting debate between me and some of the other parties involved. Now the question is, what can we ultimately learn from a figure like Neurath today? On the one hand, I think that we do live in desperate times. And there was a really interesting sequel to the show that I did at Stroom that relating to Neurath that bore that out. It was curated, it's on the work of a graphic designer named Dirk Dunbar, who's a really accomplished graphic designer who he and his father are both incredibly indebted to Gerrit Arnst. And Gerrit Dunbar's show was dedicated to a body of work he's doing on that he calls the International System of Disaster Pictograms. And it's actually pictorial forms of representation for disaster relief sites, which is an amazing project, right? And I think it's an incredibly timely, too, in terms of what it says about the state of communication and the state of urban life in some ways today, the state of public life for that matter, in as much as pictorial symbols have been sort of equated with public life. But I also, at the same time, don't entirely share the sort of the certain disenchantment that I think some of that material betrays. And I don't think it was intended that way. Certainly Dirk Dunbar didn't intend it that way, but that's sort of the way that I experienced it, and we've talked about that. So one figure I've been especially interested in that I think relates not so much to architecture, but to graphic design, but to architecture is an architect by the name of Santiago Cidigueda, whose work I've been following for about 9 years now. And in a way, I think his work has helped me put into a sort of contemporary light some of what Neurath was trying to do, and trying to, for me, his work in some ways rescues some of the most exciting aspects of, I think, what Neurath had to offer. I curated a show at the university that I teach at on his work about 2 years ago. No one saw it, which is fine, because in a way, it was an opportunity for me to think through some stuff I've been thinking about for a really long time. Like a lot of architects, you know, and these architects include people like Teddy Cruz and and other folks interested in informal and improvised forms of urbanism. Cidigueda is really interested in community-based design. He's also interested in reprogramming on a temporary basis urban and public spaces. So in this piece, for instance, this is he obtained a permit for a dumpster. Of course, traditionally, dumpsters, we deposit trash, but instead he transformed it into a playground, right? Or you could do merengue on it. So in this case, what he does is he tries to identify loopholes, legal loopholes that he can exploit for the purposes of expanding our idea about public space. Now, this is sort of a familiar strategy in some ways. I think that what's interesting, though, about Cidigueda's example is that are two things. First of all, he sometimes operates within the law and sometimes outside the law. But more importantly, what I am excited by is how he communicates and transmits his ideas. He is fantastic at gaining sort of attention for his work in the media and popular presses. He also really communicates it, right? He provides instructions and diagrams. This is a piece, a sort of temporary extension to an existing housing complex, right? And they had a party there. They were obviously having fun. And if I had time, I would show you some of the beautiful, like the really nice and interesting, conceptually powerful films that they made for this endeavor as well. Of course, as in many of his projects, he provides instructions for sort of how you can do it yourself too. And sort of this has become a sort of catchphrase, fashionable thing, but he's been really doing this for a long time, and since the 1997 anyway, and I give him special credit for that. And I think his work continues to evolve in very interesting directions. He's produced an edition. This is an image, a project for an addition to an existing art school at the University of Granada. And again, you can see that he's very aware of the fact that his projects, you know, it's not like he's saving the world through these micro interventions, right? But he is helping push issues, and these issues do gain traction in the popular presses. And this is something I think he's very conscientious of how architecture can function as an expression of civil disobedience, right? And not just as an expression of let's say, of shelter. And it can function as a form of protest, which is sort of paradoxical given its history, given that at least when I teach architecture, in the history of architecture, I'm usually teaching the history of the guys that won, right? The great empires. Another image. This is finally a project that he did with Abierta, which involved dismantling an existing building and reassembling it as a sort of student center. Again, on a sort of on a collaborative basis with mainly with volunteer support. Again, obstructions to the projects. Now, I don't think, I think that Sudhugeda's work is part of a kind of unfinished project, and I think that particularly when I look back and think about Neurath's endeavor and how extensive they were, I think that we have a long ways to go in terms of understanding the city, understanding the relationship between infrastructure and the city, and really developing viable participatory models of design that bear relevance to our contemporary moment, socially, politically, and technologically. But for me, that work certainly suggests a certain direction for maybe initiating this dialogue about infrastructure today that could bear fruit. But I'd really be interested in getting your thoughts as well on the matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nader. Questions from the audience?
Thank you. On the first images that you showed when they were protesting on the Siedlung movement,
Right.
I wonder, it's a question whether they were claiming to autonomy from the government or support from the government, or they were just defending their alternative way of.
That's a good question. This was not a revolutionary movement, and Neurath was not a revolutionary. Unlike people like Lenin, who argued for a sort of radical, revolutionary, and armed break with the existing political state of affairs, Neurath, and actually many of the Austro-Marxists around him, instead believed that you had to work within the system, and that the war economy provided a natural or can provide a sort of almost a way of segueing that transformation. This event was mostly, or this kind of gypsy urbanism, mostly appealed to these social democrats, but mostly moderate social democrats in Vienna. In fact, it was the mayor of the socialist mayor of the city standing on the podium there. The radical left was of a couple different minds, right? There were the radical left people like Otto Bauer that said these are just like, bourgeois bohemians in disguise, right? And you could see that. You read Duell magazine, and my book was in Duell magazine, right? You can appreciate that there's something about that that could appeal to the inner hippie in the sort of enlightened upper middle class liberal. So it was not a radical movement in that sense. At the same time, though, it did really draw on a sort of tradition of anarcho-socialism, on the writings of people like Kropotkin in particular, that I think we can still learn from. And I actually think, and I've sort of written this before, I think that the anarchism, the history of anarchism is profoundly misunderstood, and it probably has more lessons to teach us today as an ideology than probably any other tradition that's on the table as things stand. Soviet-style communism has discredited itself. American-style sort of Chicago school neoliberalism has discredited itself. I do think that anarchism and a sort of the history of anarchism in relationship to urbanism can still bear fruit. Not necessarily in its in all of its incarnations, and certainly not all, because it's such a vast terrain itself ideologically, but certainly some. And that's, for me, is one of the interesting aspects. And I think that was also current, that fed into some of these mass protests that you described. But it was not, for the most part, a revolutionary gathering. Yeah.
Thank you. I have two questions. One is that why do you think what was the most important reason that this maybe legacy didn't continue and it was not successful? And the second is that maybe it's more talking about micro interventions, the things that you show, and how do you relate it to
Macro.
macro?
Good
You're
question.
talking about infrastructure and these things.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, why did the project fail? I think it failed for a couple of reasons. I think that well, I think that the one reason why the project failed is because I think in the end it leaned on too heavily on technology. That I think that the sort of technological determinism, right, the belief that technology can solve everything, that I think Neurath was in some ways seduced by in the 30s, doesn't make sense. Certainly doesn't make sense from a civic point of view, right? From the point of view of of wanting to foster some kind of like democratic culture in a city, for instance. A second reason it failed, I think, had to do with, I think had to do with fascism more generally, and what the roots of fascism are. I think is a real philosophical question that we could really spend our entire lives contemplating. But I think it's a really important question for us today, because one of the things I'm really interested in my current research is to really look at alternative models of public assembly and alternative models for thinking about collective bodies, right? For thinking about community, right? Obviously this sort of caricature opposition between the master and the slave, as Hegel might call it, right? Or the worker and the bourgeoisie, right? It's no longer really tenable, right? And I think that that it's not really tenable as a way of modeling an identity. And I think that there's a vocabulary that's still to be conceptualized out there, right? That I think that I'm really interested in exploring my own work, and I'm doing another project on temporary cities, where I try to think about that question about sort of how to model identity in ways that are maybe more nuanced, right? And people like Michael Hart and Antonio Negri speak of the multitude, but I think that's even still then it's sort of like, well, what is that really about, and so forth. In answer to your second question, Sirigueda deals with the micro, but he doesn't deal with the macro. I would argue he does deal with the macro, and I think it's through the newspaper, for instance, that there are ways of positioning architecture as a form of social protest. And I think that, and sort of public protest. And I see possibility in that, right? But I'm not exactly sure how to quite formulate it. And I think that's what Sirigueda does, right? I mean, some of these pieces, they're temporary installations, but in a sense, they're also meant as provocations, right? And I think that is an important thing, and it's very difficult to really pull off in a really enduring and powerful way. But I think it's something that it represents a sort of exciting proposition, because it involves really rethinking architecture in such a, and what it is about in such a profound way. I always feel, I tell my students, I feel ambivalent, well, I feel almost guilty sometimes teaching these, surveys where all we do is dwell on one monument after the next, because in many cases they're also monuments to power, right? with relatively few exceptions, and how to contest that through architecture is a real challenge, because it's something that's so contingent and depends so deeply on institutions of power for its own, in order to sustain its own power. And how you do it, I'm not really sure, but I think it's a really interesting challenge. Yeah.
Thanks for this very interesting talk and very enlightening. Actually, I would like to a little bit you to elaborate a little bit on the things you said in the lecture, but also that you are kind of opening up now. Especially, in fact, this the relationship between your interest in Neurath and his reformist approach, which, as you said, is very much in line with the Second International and with this kind of faith that one can rationalize the means through which society reproduce itself, especially within the kind of paradox of capitalism, and which was actually very much in line with the Austro-Marxist ideology. And in fact, his attempt to rationalize means of communication and his use of a certain kind of engineering of communication, diagrams, ideograms, statistics, which, as we know, is one of the fundamental source of capitalist power. I mean, this kind of managerial approach through which society is established. And how that's, I think that's very clear, and it's really part of the time where there was actually in the 30s from the social democratic movements an incredible faith that capitalism could be tame and rationalized. And I was a little bit, and I think that's, I'm saying that because I found this a very, though from a leftist point of view, this has been always criticized as a reformist approach. I still think it's a very fundamental, courageous position, which in a way attempts to compromise, but not for the sake of the compromise, but in order to do something. And while I'm not really convinced by your appraisal of the new wave of activists, first, because I don't think they have such a systematic approach, like, for example, in the case of Otto Neurath. And second, because exactly what you said, in a way, I agree with you that those new activists are not building monuments to powers as we used to, as architects, build these monuments, but in a way, media today is the real power. And especially exhibitions and are the new mass, and curators the new, and journalists and the new clergy, basically. And they are always, I mean, most of the time their projects are very much in tune with this mechanism of media reproduction. And to me, it's very difficult to imagine a kind of anarchy scenario in this kind of condition. So I would like you to maybe elaborate a little bit on this.
I mean, that's something I struggle with a lot. I mean, you know, I mean, I grew up and was educated, you know, during a period, you know, like yourself, where there was the end of everything's, right? And the impossibility of everything in some sense, right? And this sort of sense that of exhaustion in regards to what one could achieve, right, through architecture, through urbanism. And that's something I inherited through the Frankfurt School, through certain aspects of post-structuralism, through the Venice School in architecture. And I think that part of my interest in Neurath, you know, stemmed from, and I didn't know this, you know, when I started on the project, I think from trying to really think that and wanting to be optimistic, right? And I think that, so I really share your skepticism of some of the experiments, contemporary experiments like the one that I've shown you. But I think that I think that it could be prove useful still in terms of initiating some kind of broader conversation. You know, I mean, you know, there are a lot of. So I know I'm not answering your question, but maybe what I'm really saying is that maybe what I'm trying to make a case is for why we should actually care. You know, I think that for the last 30 years, you know, I'm an academic through and through. That's my bread and butter. There's really been a really deep sense of malaise and a deep sense of detachment from the public sphere that I think is the academy, certainly in schools of architecture, is very much internalized. Certainly the graduate school that I went to, which is Columbia. And so, and I think that the people that teach in these institutions suffer, and I think that in some ways, maybe in a very, very, very small way, the public also suffers. So what I want to do through my work is to try to maybe establish a kind of dialogue. And I don't really know, honestly, I don't know, it's still something I'm thinking about, right? I mean, yeah. I mean, I don't think that you know, architecture ends with like Superstudio pronouncing the commodification of the world through design, and that all we could do is to belabor that same point and that same sense of the eternal return of the same, right? You know, that's a Nietzsche, using Nietzsche's language. So I'm sort of struggling for a vocabulary myself, and Sitageta has helped me. I think that there's a lot of other kind of work around it that I think, in some ways, has almost obscured what I think is important about his work, because it's all been sort of flattened into this, you know, DIY design. But I think there's something actually to his work that still speaks to me. One question is, you know, what happens when you actually build permanent stuff, and then it's some of the issues about power even get like ratcheted up even more. So no, I appreciate the critique, and it's something I struggle with myself. But I don't have a really adequate answer, I think, to the question you raise.
A final question? Nope. All right. Well, thank you,
Okay.
Nader.
Thank you.